I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. I thank our witnesses for being here today. The government response to the COVID-19 pandemic triggered some of the most aggressive usurpations of freedom present-day Americans have experienced. When we look back at the trillions of dollars spent, the immeasurable loss of freedom, the loss of jobs and businesses, the lost confidence in public health, and the immense societal harm created, Americans deserve to know it will not happen again. Every level of government, federal, state, and local, to some degree took part in this attack on the liberty of the American people. And corporate America, academia, and the media were happy to oblige. An apology, if we are lucky to get one, does not change the fact that the effects of COVID-19 tyranny are permanent if we don't act to change them. I will remind both my Democrat and Republican colleagues that the liberties reflected in our Constitution are not optional, and as a general matter should not be suspended for political expediency nor times of crises. In fact, the Constitution was written to constrain the power of government and secure liberty that the founders knew would be challenged, specifically in those times of crises. On March 16, 2020, the Trump administration announced, quote, 15 days to slow the spread. And far too few government leaders did anything to stop the unconstitutional tyranny that would follow over the past 4 years. 4 days after that announcement, I wrote an op-ed in National Review urging Americans that we need a, quote, date certain to return to their normal lives, or the government action in response to the pandemic would be worse than the virus itself. A year after 15 days to slow the spread, I wrote another op-ed calling for an end to the capacity limits on businesses, rules about what the vaccinated could and couldn't do inside and outside, and vaccine passports. But here we are. It was clear the COVID-19 measures were not about science or safety, but compliance and control. With the strong urging of the federal government, with particular propaganda from Drs. Fauci and Birx, by late April of 2020, 42 states, collectively leading approximately 316 million people, were subject to stay-at-home orders violating their fundamental rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Churches across the country were subject to strict social distancing and attendance limitations, while favored businesses were allowed to carry on, violating freedom of religion guaranteed in the First Amendment. Perhaps most egregiously, here in D.C., Mayor Browser joined thousands in Black Lives Matter protests while effectively banning church services for groups greater than 10 people. The White House and the CDC colluded with social media companies to suppress opposing views related to COVID-19, ranging from ivermectin to vaccine and mask mandates, violating freedom of speech protected in the First Amendment, in addition to common sense. Many Democratic governors did not consider gun stores to be essential businesses during the lockdowns, while considering marijuana dispensaries and liquor stores essential, undermining the Second Amendment. States forcibly closed businesses and deemed certain essential and others non-essential, and the CDC implemented a 120-day eviction moratorium, many of which would arguably violate the Fifth Amendment, which requires government compensation for the taking of private property for public use or a public purpose. COVID-19 measures delayed court proceedings, undermining Americans' right to a speedy trial protected by the Sixth Amendment, and I could go on and on. These constitutionally problematic government actions inflicted intense societal damage. We are still seeing the results and the consequences. The American economy experienced $14 trillion in damages due to lockdowns and governmental measures. The United States spent $6 trillion in the name of COVID, more than what the United States spent on World War II in today's dollars. This led to rampant inflation that has yet to subside. One recent analysis found that the typical American household must spend an additional $11,400 annually just to maintain the same standard of living they enjoyed of January 21, right before inflation soared to 40-year highs. Forced school closures and remote schooling erased decades of progress for students in math and reading and resulted in a quarter of our nation's students being chronically absent. We saw record high suicides, an increase of 5,000 from before the pandemic and almost 50,000 annually, and drug overdoses hit 100,000 a year. Tens of millions of Americans lost their jobs and were forced onto government assistance. In April 2020, the unemployment rate hit 15%, an all-time high since the data has been recorded. Over 100 million Americans were forced to take a vaccine with a veiled threat: your job or the jab. Regardless of what radical progressive Democrats want to claim, these vaccines were not voluntary. The federal government mandated vaccines for military personnel, healthcare workers, government contractors, and all businesses with more than 100 workers. The Biden administration bragged that their mandates covered more than 2/3 of American workers. The government lied about its efficacy and effectiveness to make these mandates more palatable. Dr. Fauci said it is as simple as black and white. You're vaccinated, you're safe. You're unvaccinated, you're at risk. Simple as that. Not sure the truth has borne that out. Former CDC Director Rochelle Walensky said the following: "Our data from the CDC today suggests that vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick." They teased the prospect of freedom if we would just suck it up and do what they said. How did that work out? They were dead wrong, and instead we got one of the biggest bait and switches of all time. We decided to inject 700 million people with vaccines regardless of the risk COVID-19 poses to them. Here's the aftermath. 1 million adverse events from the COVID-19 countermeasures have been reported to the government. Only 11 have been compensated, while Big Pharma enjoys complete immunity from liability stemming from COVID-19 vaccine injury. Hundreds of thousands of small businesses shut down permanently, while big businesses like Amazon, Walmart, and Target raked in billions. All of this for the CDC to announce last month to treat COVID-19 infections like the flu. What are we going to do to ensure our liberties are protected going forward? What are we going to do to ensure that unelected public health bureaucrats who promoted this on the American people are held accountable? We need to pass emergency powers reforms to ensure Congress can stop the expansion of the size and scope of government during times of crisis. We need to stop the funding of organizations that perpetuated this tyranny, like the United Nations World Health Organization, not accede to their power as may be occurring this month. We should pass legislation to enhance congressional oversight of the runaway healthcare bureaucracy. We need to hold officials like Dr. Fauci and Birx accountable. God forbid something like this were to happen again. We should reject mandates, vaccine mandates, mask mandates, lockdowns, and trillion-dollar spending bills. This is a good place to start. We will likely hear the following today. We should view our response to the COVID-19 pandemic as a success. We should give the people in charge the benefit of the doubt, since it was a stressful and uncertain time. Sure, there are things we can improve upon for the next pandemic, but freedom is just one factor in the many complicated case-by-case calculations governments must make. Ignore all of this. Our rights are not to be negotiated. No matter how much they try to change the subject or rewrite history, we should never forget what they did to us. We must not be the victim of another government science experiment ever again. And that's exactly why we're here today. And I appreciate the witnesses for being here, and I will now recognize